I am a Negro and was born sometime during the war in Elbert County, Georgia, and I reckon by this time I must be a little over 40 years old. My mother was not married when I was born, and I never knew who my father was or anything about him. Shortly after the war, my mother died, and I was left to the care of my uncle. All this happened before I was 8 years old, and so I can't remember very much about it. When I was about 10 years old, my uncle hired me out to captain. I had already learned how to plow and was also a good hand at picking cotton. I was told that the captain wanted me for his houseboy and that later on he was going to train me to be his coachman. To be a coachman in those days was considered a post of honor, and young as I was glad of the chance. But I had not been at the captain's a month before I was put to work on the farm with some 20 or 30 other Negroes, men, women, and children. From the beginning, the boys had the same tasks as the men and women. There was no difference. We all worked hard during the week and would frolic on Saturday nights and often on Sundays, and everybody was happy. The men got $3 a week and the women $2. I don't know what the children got. Every week my uncle collected my money for me, but it was very little of it that I ever saw. My uncle fed and clothed me, gave me a place to sleep, and allowed me 10 or 15 cents a week for spending change, as he called it. I must have been 17 or 18 years old before I got tired of that arrangement and felt that I was man enough to be working for myself and handling my own wages. The other boys about my age and size were drawing their own pay, and they used to laugh at me and call me baby because my old uncle was always on hand to draw my pay. Worked up by these things, I made a break for liberty. Unknown to my uncle or the captain, I went off to a neighboring plantation and hired myself out to another man. The new landlord agreed to give me 40 cents a day and furnish me one meal. I thought that was doing fine. Bright and early, one Monday morning I started for work, still not letting the others know anything about it, but they found it out before sundown. The captain came over to the new place and brought some kind of officer of the law. The officer pulled out a long piece of paper from his pocket and read it to my new employer. When this was done, I heard my new boss say, "I beg your pardon, Captain. I didn't know this nigger was bound out to you, or I wouldn't have hired him." "He certainly is bound out to me," said the captain. "He belongs to me until he is 21, and I'm going to make him know his place." So I was carried back to the captain's. That night, he made me strip off my clothing down to my waist, had me tied to a tree in his backyard, ordered his foreman to give me 30 lashes with a buggy whip across my bare back, and stood by until it was done. After that experience, the captain made me stay on his place night and day, but my uncle still continued to draw my money. When I reached 21, the captain told me I was a free man, but he urged me to stay with him. He said he would treat me right and pay me as much as anybody else would. The captain's son and I were about the same age, and the captain said that as he had owned my mother and uncle during slavery, and as his son didn't want me to leave them since I had been with them so long, he wanted me to stay with the old family. And I stayed. I signed a contract, that is, I made my mark, for 1 year. The captain was to give me $3.50 a week and furnish me a little house on the plantation, a one-room log cabin similar to those used by his other laborers. During that year, I married Mandy. For several years, Mandy had been the house servant for the captain, his wife, his son, and his 3 daughters, and they all seemed to think a good deal of her. As evidence of their regard, they gave us a suit of furniture, which cost about $25, and we set up housekeeping in one of the captain's 2-room shanties. I thought I was the biggest man in Georgia. Mandy still kept her place in the big house after our marriage. We did so well for the first year that I renewed my contract for the second year, and for the third, fourth, and fifth year, I did the same thing. Before the end of the 5th year, the captain had died, and his son, who had married some 2 or 3 years before, took charge of the plantation. Also, for 2 or 3 years, this son had been serving at Atlanta in some big office to which he had been elected. I think it was in the legislature or something of that sort. Anyhow, all the people called him Senator. At the end of the 5th year, the senator suggested that I sign up a contract for 10 years. Then he said we wouldn't have to fix up papers every year. I asked my wife about it. She consented, and so I made a 10-year contract. This was the beginning of the senator's convict camp. These men were prisoners who had been leased by the senator from the state of Georgia at about $200 each per year, the state agreeing to pay for guards and physicians, for necessary inspection, for inquests, all rewards for escaped convicts, the cost of litigation, and all other incidental camp expenses. When I saw these men in shackles and the guards with their guns, I was scared nearly to death. I felt like running away, but I didn't know where to go. And if there had been any place to go to, I would have had to leave my wife and child behind. We free laborers held a meeting. We all wanted to quit. We sent a man to tell the senator about it. Word came back that we were all under contract for 10 years and that the senator would hold us to the letter of the contract or put us in chains and lock us up, the same as the other prisoners. It was made plain to us by some white people we talked to that in the contracts we had signed, we had all agreed to be locked up in a stockade at night or at any other time that our employer saw fit. Further, we learned that we could not lawfully break our contract for any reason and go and hire ourselves to somebody else without the consent of our employer. And more than that, if we got mad and ran away, we could be run down by bloodhounds, arrested without process of law, and be returned to our employer, who, according to the contract, might beat us brutally or administer any other kind of punishment that he thought proper. In other words, we had sold ourselves into slavery, and what could we do about it? The white folks had all the courts, all the guns, all the hounds, all the railroads, all the telegraph wires, all the newspapers, all the money, and nearly all the land, and we had only our ignorance, our poverty, and our empty hands. We decided that the best thing to do was to shut our mouths, say nothing, and go back to work. And most of us worked side by side with those convicts during the remainder of the 10 years. The troubles of the free laborers began at the close of the 10-year period. To a man, they all wanted to quit when the time was up. To a man, they all refused to sign new contracts, even for 1 year, not to say anything of 10 years. And just when we thought that our bondage was at an end, we found that it had really just begun. 2 or 3 years before, or about a year and a half after the senator had started his camp, he had established a large store which was called the commissary. All of us free laborers were compelled to buy our supplies, food, clothing, etc. from that store. We never used any money in our dealings with the commissary, only tickets or orders, and we had a general settlement once each year in October. In this store, we would charge all sorts of high prices for goods because every year we would come out in debt to our employer. If not that, we seldom had more than $5 or $10 coming to us, and that for a whole year's work. Well, at the close of the 10th year, when we kicked and meant to leave the senator, he said to some of us with a smile, "Boys, I'm sorry you're going to leave me. I hope you will do well in your new places, so well that you will be able to pay me the little balances which most of you owe me." Word was sent out for all of us to meet him at the commissary at 2 o'clock. There he told us that after we had signed what he called a written acknowledgement of our debts, we might go and look for new places. The storekeeper took us one by one and read to us statements of our accounts. According to the books, there was no man of us who owed the senator less than $100. Some of us were put down for as much as $200. I owed $105 according to the bookkeeper. These debts were not accumulated for 1 year, but ran back for 3 and 4 years. So we were told, in spite of the fact that we understood that we had had a full settlement at the end of each year. But no one of us would have dared to dispute a white man's word. Oh no, not in those days. Besides, we fellows didn't care anything about the amounts. We were after getting away, and we had been told that we might go if we signed the acknowledgments. We would have signed anything just to get away. So we stepped up, we did, and made our marks. That same night, we were rounded up by a constable and 10 or 12 white men who aided him, and we were locked up, every one of us, in one of the senator's stockades. The next morning, it was explained to us by the 2 guards appointed to watch us that, in the papers we had signed the day before, we had not only made acknowledgement of our indebtedness, but that we had also agreed to work for the senator until the debts were paid by hard labor. And from that day forward, we were treated just like convicts. Really, we had made ourselves lifetime slaves, or peons, as the laws called us, but call it slavery, peonage, or whatnot. The truth is, we lived in a hell on earth what time we spent in the senator's peon camp. The working day on a peon farm begins with sunrise and ends when the sun goes down. Or in other words, the average peon works from 10 to 12 hours each day with 1 hour for dinner. Hot or cold, sun or rain, this is the rule. Today, I am told there are 6 or 7 of these private camps in Georgia. That is to say, camps where most of the convicts are leased from the state of Georgia. But there are hundreds and hundreds of farms all over the state where Negroes, and in some cases poor white folks, are held in bondage on the ground that they are working out debts, or where the contracts which they have made hold them in a kind of perpetual bondage, because under those contracts, they may not quit one employer and hire out to another except by and with the knowledge and consent of the former employer. When I had served as a peon for nearly 3 years, and you remember that they claimed that I owed them only $165, one of the bosses came to me and said that my time was up. He happened to be the one who was said to be living with my wife. He gave me a new suit of overalls, which cost about 75 cents, took me in a buggy, and carried me across the Broad River into South Carolina, set me down, and told me to get. I didn't have a cent of money, and I wasn't feeling well, but somehow I managed to get a move on me. I begged my way to Columbia. In 2 or 3 days, I ran across a man looking for laborers to carry to Birmingham, and I joined his gang. I have been here in the Birmingham district since they released me, and I reckon I'll die either in a coal mine or an iron furnace. It doesn't make much difference which. Either is better than a Georgia peon camp, and a Georgia peon camp is hell itself.